Chapter 1. The Era of Chinese Preeminence. Through many millennia of Chinese civilization, China was never obliged to deal with other countries or civilizations that were comparable to it in scale and sophistication. India was known to the Chinese, as Mao later noted, but for much of history it was divided into separate kingdoms. The two civilizations exchanged goods and Buddhist influences along the Silk Road but were elsewhere walled off from casual contact by the almost impenetrable Himalayas and the Tibetan Plateau. The massive and forbidding deserts of Central Asia separated China from the Near Eastern cultures of Persia and Babylonia, and even more from the Roman Empire. Trade caravans undertook intermittent journeys, but China as a society did not engage societies of comparable scale and achievement. Though China and Japan shared a number of core cultural and political institutions, neither was prepared to recognize the other's superiority. Their solution was to curtail contact for centuries at a time. Europe was even further away in what the Chinese considered the Western Oceans, by definition inaccessible to Chinese culture and pitiably incapable of acquiring it, as the emperor told a British envoy in 1793. The territorial claims of the Chinese empire stopped at the water's edge. As early as the Song dynasty, 960 to 1279, China led the world in nautical technology. Its fleets could have carried the empire into an era of conquest and exploration. Yet China acquired no overseas colonies and showed relatively little interest in the countries beyond its coast. It developed no rationale for venturing abroad to convert the barbarians to Confucian principles or Buddhist virtues. When the conquering Mongols commandeered the Song fleet, and its experienced captains, they mounted two attempted invasions of Japan. Both were turned back by inclement weather, the kamikaze, or divine wind, of Japanese law. Yet when the Mongol dynasty collapsed, the expeditions, though technically feasible, were never again attempted. No Chinese leader ever articulated a rationale for why China would want to control the Japanese archipelago. But in the early years of the Ming dynasty, between 1405 and 1433, China launched one of history's most remarkable and mysterious naval enterprises. Admiral Zheng He set out in fleets of technologically unparalleled treasure ships to destinations as far as Java, India, the Horn of Africa, and the Strait of Hormuz. At the time of Zheng's voyages, the European age of exploration had not yet begun. China's fleet possessed what would have seemed an unbridgeable technological advantage. In the size, sophistication, and number of its vessels, it dwarfed the Spanish Armada, which was still 150 years away. Historians still debate the actual purpose of these missions. Zheng He was a singular figure in the age of exploration, a Chinese Muslim eunuch conscripted into imperial service as a child. He fits no obvious historical precedent. At each stop on his journeys, he formally proclaimed the magnificence of China's new emperor, bestowed lavish gifts on the rulers he encountered, and invited them to travel in person or send envoys to China. There, they were to acknowledge their place in the Sinocentric world order by performing the ritual kowtow to acknowledge the emperor's superiority. Yet beyond declaring China's greatness and issuing invitations to portentous ritual, Zheng He displayed no territorial ambition. He brought back only gifts, or tribute. He claimed no colonies or resources for China beyond the metaphysical bounty of extending the limits of all under heaven. At most he can be said to have created favorable conditions for Chinese merchants, through a kind of early exercise of Chinese soft power. Zheng He's expeditions stopped abruptly in 1433, coincident with the recurrence of threats along China's northern land frontier. The next emperor ordered the fleet dismantled, and the records of Zheng He's voyages destroyed. The expeditions were never repeated. Though Chinese traders continued to ply the routes Zheng He sailed, China's naval abilities faded, so much so that the Ming rulers' response to the subsequent menace of piracy off China's southeast coast was to attempt a forced migration of the coastal population 10 miles inland. China's naval history was thus a hinge that failed to swing, technically capable of dominance, China retired voluntarily from the field of naval exploration just as Western interest was beginning to take hold. China's splendid isolation nurtured a particular Chinese self-perception. Chinese elites grew accustomed to the notion that China was unique, not just a great civilization among others, but civilization itself. A British translator wrote in 1850, "An intelligent European, accustomed to reflect on the state of a number of countries enjoying a variety of different advantages, and laboring each under peculiar disadvantages, could, by a few well-directed questions, and from very little data, form a tolerably correct notion of the state of a people hitherto unknown to him, but it would be a great error to suppose that this is the case with the Chinese. Their exclusion of foreigners and confinement to their own country has, by depriving them of all opportunities of making comparisons, sadly circumscribed their ideas. They are thus totally unable to free themselves from the dominion of association, and judge everything by rules of purely Chinese convention." China knew, of course, of different societies around its periphery in Korea, Vietnam, Thailand, Burma, but in the Chinese perception, China was considered the center of the world, the Middle Kingdom, and other societies were assessed as gradations from it. As the Chinese saw it, a host of lesser states that imbibed Chinese culture and paid tribute to China's greatness constituted the natural order of the universe. The borders between China and the surrounding peoples were not so much political and territorial demarcations as cultural differentiations. The outward radiance of Chinese culture throughout East Asia led the American political scientist Lucian Pye to comment famously that, in the modern age, China remains a civilization pretending to be a nation-state. The pretensions underlying this traditional Chinese world order endured well into the modern era. As late as 1863, China's emperor, himself a member of a foreign Manchu dynasty that had conquered China 2 centuries earlier, dispatched a letter informing Abraham Lincoln of China's commitment to good relations with the United States. The emperor based his communication on the grandiloquent assurance that, having, with reverence, received the commission from heaven to rule the universe, we regard both the Middle Empire, China, and the outside countries as constituting one family, without any distinction. When the letter was dispatched, China had already lost 2 wars with the Western powers, which were busy staking out spheres of interest in Chinese territory. The emperor seems to have treated these catastrophes as similar to other barbarian invasions that were overcome, in the end, by China's endurance and superior culture. For most of history, there was, in fact, nothing particularly fanciful about Chinese claims. With each generation, the Han Chinese had expanded from their original base in the Yellow River Valley, gradually drawing neighboring societies into various stages of approximation of Chinese patterns. Chinese scientific and technological achievements equaled, and frequently outstripped, those of their Western European, Indian, and Arab counterparts. Not only was the scale of China traditionally far beyond that of the European states in population and in territory, until the Industrial Revolution, China was far richer. United by a vast system of canals connecting the great rivers and population centers, China was for centuries the world's most productive economy, and most populous trading area. But since it was largely self-sufficient, other regions had only peripheral comprehension of its vastness and its wealth. In fact, China produced a greater share of total world GDP than any Western society in 18 of the last 20 centuries. As late as 1820, it produced over 30% of world GDP, an amount exceeding the GDP of Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and the United States combined. Western observers encountering China in the early modern era were stunned by its vitality and material prosperity. Writing in 1736, the French Jesuit Jean-Baptiste du Halde summed up the awestruck reactions of Western visitors to China. The riches peculiar to each province, and the facility of conveying merchandise, by means of rivers and canals, have rendered the domestic trade of the empire always very flourishing. The inland trade of China is so great that the commerce of all Europe is not to be compared therewith, the provinces being like so many kingdoms, which communicate to each other their respective productions. 30 years later, the French political economist François Quesnay went even further. No one can deny that this state is the most beautiful in the world, the most densely populated, and the most flourishing kingdom known. Such an empire as that of China is equal to what all Europe would be if the latter were united under a single sovereign. China traded with foreigners and occasionally adopted ideas and inventions from abroad. But more often the Chinese believed that the most valuable possessions and intellectual achievements were to be found within China. Trade with China was so prized that it was with only partial exaggeration that Chinese elites described it not as ordinary economic exchange but as tribute to China's superiority.